Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, John from MS Pearce. This is Ukraine war. No, it's not. It's a US politics update, a kind of international political update, really, concerning the tariffs. Just a somewhat shorter video than my longer one I was going to do, including all of the issues going on in US politics. I'm going to separate them out because we're just going to concentrate on tariffs here for reasons of timing. Now, the White House has announced that China now faces up to 245% tariffs on imports to the United States as a result of its retaliatory actions. Both sides seem to be upping their attacks on each other. But I really do think this is a trade war that the US will lose. China holds all the cards, and we're just going to go through some of those cards that China holds. So I'm hoping that this is worth your while listening to. It'll be a good few minutes of Alistair Campbell laying out 10 cards that China has. So when you hear Donald Trump talk in the White House with Zelensky about Zelensky not having any cards and he's not really in the competition at all or in the race or whatever, you're thinking, oh, I'm not sure you've got a good appraisal of the situation, because actually Ukraine does hold some cards, and the EU is one of the cards that Ukraine holds, and so on and so forth. But here, I don't think Trump and his team have appraised the economic landscape accurately enough, and they, I don't think, realised when they started this trade war quite how the world will unite against the US, how they'll start doing deals with each other, and actually how the US doesn't hold the cards here, that China holds the cards. So here's Alistair Campbell from the podcast or the YouTube channel The Rest is Politics with with Rory Stewart as well. Here are his 10 cards that China holds
in what's going on now.
Okay, go on then. Give us your 10.
Right, well, number one is that China historically and now playing a long game up against somebody who is impulsive, clearly doesn't understand trade, making it up as he goes along. They have been preparing for this kind of breach for a long time, whereas Trump's team doesn't even know what he's going to be doing day to day. So that's the first one. The second one is that the soft power damage that Trump is doing to America is opening up unexpected opportunities for improved trade and diplomacy for China. Now, Xi, as you know, is currently on a tour of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia. That was going to happen anyway, but that will be part of a reset in the region. They've already had their first economic dialogue in 5 years with Japan and South Korea, directly because Trump brought in the tariffs. And they're also, the European Union is talking about we need to get moving with China. So that's the second one. Third one, they have got powers of retaliation that we talked about this a little bit in relation to soybean when we first talked about tariffs, but they've got powers of retaliation beyond just tit for tat tariffs. So, for example, what they're doing on the global rare earths, I think, is really interesting. Something like 3/4 of American rare earths come out of China, and they're slapping all sorts of export controls on the firms that send them to, say, defense, robotics, etc.
Let me come in on that quickly. Yeah. If we're gonna make it through 10, I'll have to come in on number 3 and then let you keep rolling on your other 7. Or this will be going things. So I think that's a really good point. So critical minerals and rare earths are absolutely vital for the modern world. So in addition to the rare earths, things like cobalt, lithium, nickel, even copper are absolutely vital for batteries above all, which powers most of the technological revolution, most of the green revolution, and absolutely vital for semiconductor chips and all the stuff that America needs for its technology. And the problem is that it's not that China just owns a huge amount of the mines around the world. So they own the mines in Democratic Republic of Congo, they have big contracts even developed world. It's that even that stuff which China doesn't mine itself is processed in China.
This is a really good point here, and not something that we hear discussed too much. But the idea is that not only does China have the power to not just do tariffs and retaliate with more tariffs, but actually stop things. And we're going to go on to talk about this in a second. In fact, it's a good time to interrupt these guys to go to some of the things that China is doing in terms of not just whacking on tariffs, but stopping things being sold. So Boeing has just lost 8,830 plane deliveries to China because of Trump's ridiculous tariffs over the next 20 years. Boeing is one of our greatest American companies. The final assembly and supply chain job losses will be huge. So this is China saying that they will not accept they will not allow, they're not going to buy any American planes and any components from America for those planes. So then you're thinking, well, are they just going to give their business to Airbus, which is the French, British, European concern? So Chinese government officials are considering asking Airbus to supply any new jets with an extra set of engines after ordering its airlines to stop accepting new Boeing aircraft. So I don't know if that means that they're going to have existing Boeing aircraft that might need new engines, and they're going to whack on Airbus engines to them. I don't quite understand how that goes, but anyway, you can see the problem here. So it's they're stopping critical minerals, they're stopping American aviation, the American aviation industry exporting, and now we're hearing that China forbids all billionaires to invest in the US. China says that the US is no longer a safe place for them. So that's another thing they're doing. Then we're hearing that thanks to Trump's trade war, Hong Kong moments ago this is yesterday, announced a ban on all items being shipped to the US through the Hong Kong Postal Service. Quote, the US is unreasonable, bullying and imposing tariffs abusively. Hong Kong Post will definitely not collect any so-called tariffs on behalf of the US and will suspend the acceptance of postal items containing goods destined to the US. So going back to what these guys are saying, China, I think, have a greater ability to do things that hurt the US more than the US can hurt China. As I said yesterday, China used to import 20% of their goods from the US during the first Trump administration when they whacked tariffs on China, and that hurt China, obviously. And now it's going to hurt China less because they are down, I think, to something like 12.8% of their imported goods are from the US. And so they have kind of diversified more already in advance of this. And then it's more subtle as well, because it's not so easy that the US then starts mining more rare earth minerals themselves, either in the US or getting them from elsewhere. But the processing of these minerals is incredibly polluting, and it's not something you want to do on American soil. They'd actually much rather China take on all of that and they just buy the finished product.
And the reason why it's processed in China is you don't want to be running a factory processing the stuff in the United States, because it is unbelievably not just capital investment setting up the plant, but it is massive pollution, environmental impact of running this slurry, running this processing plant. So nobody wants it. And in fact, if you tried to open those kinds of plants in Europe or the United States, you would face huge public opposition, because the impact on the landscape, the environment, on water quality is unbelievable. So China has, as you say, a kind of stranglehold on that. Back to you.
Well, also on that, I mean, I didn't realize 10% of chickens in China come from America. We talked before, 50% of soybean, roughly 50% of soybean into China. So they're going to different markets now. And
we're hearing they're going to Australia for their beef, Brazil for their soybeans. I don't know where for the chicken, but this will, and indeed, what else is happening is, if we go to here, China turns to Canada for oil. So Chinese refiners have cut US oil imports by 90% and are now buying record amounts of Canadian crude oil. So, yeah, and also Financial Times reports that China is turning to the EU to offset losses and redirect exports. Beijing has sent delegations to cities like Stockholm, Budapest, Oslo, Hanover and London to boost investment and trade. I mean, this is exactly what the UK would want at the moment, needing sort of investment and economic opportunities, and perhaps there can be some joy there. But, yeah, it could be that because the US are the aggressors here, everyone's more willing to go to anyone else in the world to replace the US in those trading relationships, but the US is going to find it more difficult because they've pissed off everyone. So the US goes, well, I'm going to replace China with these guys, and these guys will be like, well, hang on, you've got tariffs on us. So if you're going to do that, then actually it puts these other guys, these alternatives, in a power position in negotiations with the US. So yeah, I think China do hold the cards.
Also planning to up the regulation on American companies as a way of leverage on the US. And this is my next point, is that China will think that America needs them more than they need America. So going back to your point just there, 3 years ago, America relied on China for 532 key product categories, which was 4 times the level that they relied on in 2000. China's reliance on American products cut in half by the same period. And as a result, the American market is not as important as it was to China. At the start of the first Trump trade war in 2018, American-bound exports made up 20%, almost 20% of China's total exports. 2023 down to 12.8. So
sorry, actually, that's the other way around. That's not imports into China. I was saying that as imports into China. That's exports from China to the US. In other words, the US isn't buying as much of China's stuff, so it's not so important for China as the US might think.
That balance is changing. And they think, this is my next one, they think that they helped to force the climb down on smartphones because they educated the American people, not least with some of their very funny memes. They educated the American people and American politicians about the extent to which companies like Apple were completely locked in to Chinese supply systems. So I don't know what number I'm at now, but next one, Elon Musk. They have got Elon Musk.
Okay.
And they think that's an advantage to them. Unless Trump does what Scaramucci keeps saying he's going to do, get him right outside the tent. So they think Musk was an important voice in arguing for what they were trying to do. Next point.
And the reason for that is that Musk both relies on imports from China for his goods, thinks tariffs are mad. He's been out calling Peter Navarro, who's Trump's tariff guru, Peter Retardo, in an incredibly offensive way on X. But also has opened large Tesla factories in China. So Musk is a very, very clear example of this sort of split, which we've talked about within Trump's camp. Between the sort of tech bros who tend to be very anti-tariff, often pro-immigration, particularly skilled immigration, against the sort of MAGA base that tends to lean in a very different direction. Okay, your next one.
My next one is America has given China the moral high ground, which is a rare, rare, rare achievement for them.
Really interesting point this, because then they can sell that to their population. Whereas the United States, I think, is struggling to sell the idea of these tariffs as being a good thing for Americans and the way they've gone about it to their population. Now, the MAGA base will sync this up, and you look at Marjorie Taylor Greene's town hall, where she's ejecting people violently who are even asking sensible questions. But these people being thrown out, being cheered on by some of her MAGA supporters who are just in for a penny, in for a pound. But for everyone else, this is all pretty distasteful stuff. And it's very difficult for Trump to assume the moral high ground here. And actually, China can say, well, look, America started this. This is Trump's thing. So they've got an ability to sell to their population the discomfort of a trade war being the fault. And it's the same for all nations around the world. The fault is with Trump and with the United States. And that is really significant for being able to politically control the narrative.
So, and that in turn, this is actually coming out in his little tour of some of the language that President Xi Jinping is using. It gives China somebody to blame. You keep making the point that Chinese economy is not as strong as it was. Yes, it's growing, but it's not growing as fast as it was. And they've got all sorts of problems, their housing crisis, their youth unemployment crisis, and so forth. But this is giving them somebody else to blame. And when the economy goes tits up, it's always good to have somebody else to blame. And Trump is such a big figure in this debate. And they've been developing other markets. Now my last two, I think I'm up to 9. My last two, one is transshipment. And this is something Navarro's onto. He knows that what China does to get around tariffs is basically to, and this may be again why he's in Vietnam and Cambodia, even though they were going to get hit very hard as well, is actually that Chinese products get shipped into a country that is not under very high tariffs, and then they make their way there. And they think they're very clever at doing that because they've been clever at doing that for quite a long time. And then the final one, they believe that Trump will have to back down first. And that will be humiliating for him. And the reason for that is that prices, they can wear rising prices in a way that the Americans can't.
This is really important. So actually, what Rory Stewart goes on to talk about, the two things: how much is this costing each side? So how much will this cost China? How much will this cost the US? But more importantly, he goes on to say, is the political dimension. So it doesn't matter how much you're comparing, how much the costs are for these two countries, but who can politically weather the storm no matter how much the cost is better. And because China is a dictatorship, and as much as Trump wants the US to be a dictatorship, it's not. It's still a democracy. That allows China to be able to control the population and therefore the narrative and the information and their sense of what's going on much better. And he will be, even if people are deeply, deeply uncomfortable with the trade war within China and are suffering as an oppressive dictatorship, he'll be able to deal with that much better than those in the US who will take to the streets, and you will start getting, the midterm elections will be an absolute disaster for Trump, and things will go wrong, and he won't get reelected, or even worse. So people will take to the streets in a major way.
They could even wear a recession in the way that the Americans can't, not least because they're not a dictatorship at all, and related to that, the weakening reputation of the American dollar and the American Treasury bonds. So all of that bad news says they think Trump will back down first. There you are. There's the Chinese view.
And brilliant stuff. So that's a really good sort of analysis there. A full US-China financial decoupling could wipe out $2.5 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs. In an extreme scenario, US investors might be forced to sell $800 billion in Chinese stocks, and China would liquidate $1.7 trillion in US assets, including treasuries and equities. And this is where kind of the bond market gets affected, and then that affects the value of the dollar. And we've gone through all of these things that China is able to bring to bear against the Americans that I think the Americans lack in terms of leverage. Trump then comes out and say, our farmers are great, but because of their greatness, they are always put on the front line with our adversaries such as China whenever there's a trade negotiation, or in this case, a trade war. The same thing happened in my first term. China was brutal to our farmers. I these patriots to just hold on, whatever that means, and a great trade deal was made. I rewarded our farmers with a payment of $28 billion here. So this is what I talked about the other day a number of times, that as much as he claimed the US Treasury took in tariffs, he then had to pay out the back door to the people who were completely screwed over by the tariffs. So that trade war with China, the soybean war, meant that he had to then go cap in hand to the, not cap in hand, and like suitcase full of dollars in hand to the farmers and say, sorry about all that, here's all the money. And it's just robbing Peter to pay Paul, and is completely pointless and actually caused more damage than it generated income. And the same will be happening again. In fact, he's looking like he's lining up to pay the farmers again, who have been massively complaining that they are on the front line of this, and they are getting screwed over. And he's taken their vote, and it's like they should have learnt from Trump 1.0, right? But he's taken their vote and he's absolutely screwed them over. He said it was a great transaction for the USA. That's arguably not the case until crooked Joe Biden came in and didn't enforce it. China largely reneged on the deal, although they behaved during the Trump administration. Of course, now he's blaming everything on Joe Biden. Pretty typical, only buying a portion of what they agreed to buy. They had zero respect for the crooked Biden administration, and who came to blame them for that? Who can blame them for that? So now he's even siding with China over, like, Joe Biden is the biggest enemy. He's a bigger enemy than Russia, and Putin, bigger enemy than China is Xi Jinping. So he's trying to slag off China, but he can't stop slagging off Joe Biden even more. And this takes us back to the time when we saw the T-shirts of the people at the Trump convention that said, I'd rather be a Ruskie than a Democrat. And you've got, the Democrat, your own Americans, like Trump has said, the enemy within. The greatest enemy come from within. So as much as he slags off China, He hates Joe Biden, and he hates the Democrats even more. And that's a problem with MAGA republicanism, is that it's insanely divisive. China largely reneged on the deal, blah, blah, blah. Slags off Biden. Interestingly, they just reneged on the big Boeing deal, saying that they will, quote, not take possession of fully committed to aircraft. The USA will protect our farmers. So he's saying, the hilarious thing here is he said the Chinese reneged on Joe Biden, how weak Joe Biden was there. And then he's just admitted that the Chinese have just reneged on possibly 8,600 Boeing planes. It's like, who's the weak one now then, mate? Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Then we have the whole TikTok thing. Do I go into the whole TikTok thing? There's a really good analysis here from Niels Groeneveld on what's going on with TikTok as well. Strategic blunder that hands China the narrative win. Okay, let's go through this. If TikTok chooses to exit the US market in response to Trump's threats and does so while explicitly blaming him in-app to its millions of American users, the result will be one of the most potent cases of geopolitical blowback in recent memory. That isn't just a tech story, it's a masterclass in how soft power, strategic communications, and asymmetric influence can converge to turn an attempted show of strength into a self-inflicted defeat from a Chinese strategic perspective. This confrontation is already offering Beijing a rare win without firing a shot. The immediate narrative impact would be devastating for Trump. TikTok's user base in the United States includes over 170 million people, heavily concentrated among the Gen Z and millennials, a critical voting bloc. If TikTok engineers its exit with a deliberate campaign informing users that their access is being terminated because of Trump personally, it would represent a direct viral political attack at scale, delivered through a platform specifically designed to optimize engagement and emotional reaction. As a sidebar, if you've seen the TikTok memes, the AI generated videos, or kind of almost cartoon videos of JD Vance in makeup and with long hair and dressed as a woman. This is all in retaliation to JD Vance calling Chinese peasants. Now, the power of TikTok can be incredibly useful for the Chinese here in developing resentment for the Trump administration, JD Vance, amongst American voters themselves. So no traditional media outlets can match the reach, virality, and emotional influence of TikTok's algorithm when it targets a message. Trump would effectively be campaigning against a media platform with more daily active users than most cable news networks have viewers. And unlike traditional media, this one speaks in memes, trends, and emotional microbursts that resonate with digital natives. It's an asymmetric political weapon, and one Trump himself would have activated. From a Chinese strategic perspective, TikTok's withdrawal could be spun as a principled stand against American overreach, framing the US as a paranoid, anti-competitive, and hostile to foreign innovation. This narrative can be amplified not only domestically in China, but throughout the global south and among Americans' tech partners in Europe and Asia. It undermines Washington's moral high ground in tech governance and reinforces China's long-standing claim that the US doesn't actually believe in free markets when it's not winning. Beijing can point to the TikTok ban as evidence of America's decline, its inability to compete with Chinese platforms on merit, forcing it to resort to bans, threats, and regulatory sabotage at a time when nations around the world are debating digital sovereignty and seeking alternative to US tech dominance. This would validate the Chinese model. Now, what's even more fascinating is that hitherto, up till now, the Trump MAGA Republican movement has benefited from Russian and Chinese influence to get him elected because they thought Trump was our man. Now Trump's done this insane trade war. They can use that against the Americans, against the Trump administration in terms of disinformation, particularly the Chinese here. What's just happened in the last few days? We've heard that the GEC and the FEMI, the only entities that the US now has are only spending $50 million a year on it to combat disinformation, has been shut down. So you've got Voice of America defunded, our Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty defunded. You've got the group that goes after foreign interference in US elections being disbanded. And you've got the GEC, the anti-disinformation department, being eliminated. So at a time when actually the Trump administration could probably do with being able to fight Russian and, Chinese disinformation against Trump, He's got rid of that all because actually it was in his favor at that point, and now he's going to need it, and it won't be there. This is totally significant. Meanwhile, it continues. ByteDance is unlikely to see this as a terminal defeat. TikTok's exit can be temporary, symbolic, and strategically reversible. ByteDance could re-enter the market later under a new brand with a different ownership structure or licensing model, keeping its algorithm and IP intact while satisfying legal requirements. It can offload US operations to a seemingly independent third party, masking real control through contractual and algorithmic backdoors, much like how Huawei tried to navigate Western restrictions through proxies and branding shifts. Even during its absence, TikTok's core technologies can continue to shape global trends, infiltrate Western cultural channels via influencers and content syndication, and maintain algorithmic superiority. Economically, the decision could have wider consequences. A forced exit of one of the most globally dominant Chinese apps may prompt Beijing to retaliate against US companies operating in China. Apple, Tesla, and other major US firms could become targets of regulatory tightening, consumer boycotts, or national security reviews. Under the same logic the US applies to TikTok, American investors may grow increasingly uneasy about the precedent being set. If a successful foreign company can be banned purely based on political mood, what's to stop others from suffering the same fate in other jurisdictions? The reputational risk of the US as a stable, rules-based market could rise, especially if allies perceive the move as more populist than principled. Most critically, this battle exposes a strategic blind spot in Trump's approach to China, an underestimation of how influence is wielded in the modern information age. TikTok isn't just a data collection app. It's a cultural force, a viral engine of influence that speaks directly to the identities, grievances, and aspirations of the youngest generation. Attempting to shut it down without offering an equally compelling US-backed alternative leaves a vacuum that will be filled not by Facebook or YouTube, but by resentment, memes, and activism. Trump may win headlines and a few points with hawkish voters, but at the cost of alienating millions of digital natives, empowering China's soft power apparatus, and undermining the US's claim as to be the global leader in innovation and openness. In this light, Trump's attack on TikTok may go down not as a triumph of national security policy, but as a short-sighted, politically charged move that gifted Beijing a narrative coup, sparked domestic backlash, and showed that the US can be baited into damaging its own tech credibility. In trying to kneecap an app, he may have empowered a movement and misfired in a war he didn't truly understand. So I think that's a fascinating analysis there. And if TikTok is in the crosshairs of the Trump administration in this trade war with China, that could really come back and bite Trump on the arse there. Now, what else has happened? So, overall, US imports are at a minus 64%. It's got to be one of the most insane numbers in economic history, says Arnaud Bertrand. I don't think people quite comprehend how disruptive that's going to be. So imports 64% down is one claim. To put this in context, says Chris Owicki, it's twice the drop that happened during the COVID pandemic and not far off the 70% drop caused by the Great Depression. And unlike either, it's been caused deliberately. If it's sustained, American shops will be empty within weeks. So, there are some pretty doom and gloom outlooks here. The value, says Roman Sheremetyev, of the US dollar continues to fall daily. So does the US stock market. And guess why? Of course, it's a trade war. So the dollar is going down, and that's going to affect imports and exports, of course. Get ready for a Trump rage post about Powell. So what's happening here? Well, we have the governor of the Fed, guy in charge of the federal bank, Federal Reserves and all that, is laying into the tariff trade war.
The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth.
So when you've got the Fed Reserve Chair saying that, that's going to tank the stock market. And what happened yesterday after he said that? The stock market went haywire. More than 1.5 trillion was erased from the US stock market today. And he's not lying. He's just telling the truth about the effects of this trade war being much greater than people might have originally thought. So then when CEOs asked on Fox News, Trump's economic advisor just had a malfunction.
And so financial markets are forward-looking. They'll start to realize that. CEOs are forward-looking. They'll start to realize that also. So is there volatility in the short run? Absolutely. Is a recession possible? Well, it's not my base case, but making predictions is difficult for anyone. And so financial...
So is a recession likely? And he can't really, he has just a brain fart there. Because, of course, he can't admit that, recession is now going to be much more likely than it was, 2 months ago. So Powell then said stuff like this.
In terms of the cutbacks in funding and for science and things like that, we do see in areas, particularly in cities that have a lot of universities and research hospitals and research institutions, we're really hearing significant layoffs and significant impacts on employment. I don't know how much that will total up to. And of course, in addition, cutting back on scientific research may have implications for economic growth, for productivity, for health, for all kinds of things. But those are very difficult to estimate in real time.
Is it like every dollar spent on the NIH, so, science research in the US by the federal government, it brings back something like $2.76 in something like, I can't remember the exact number, but somewhere between $2 and $3 in terms of economic activity. So you start slashing funding just to, Doge doing their thing and making the government more efficient or whatever they're claiming. They're actually just destroying their own economic activity. And when you then have a trade war added to the economic woes, this will, mean that you're going to go towards a recession because, people are going to be losing their jobs, then they're going to be drawing on welfare, then your economic activity will go down, then everything becomes more expensive because you're in a trade war, and then that depresses economic activity and so on and so forth. You get into this cycle and you're in a lot of trouble. And that appears to be entirely self-inflicted, not only by getting Doge to do their thing, but then starting this trade war. And then you get the situation where he's just lying. Donald Trump has got to this position where he's lying about the cost of eggs. He's lying about the everything. The United States, he says, is taking in record numbers in tariffs. And of course, not of course, but they aren't. Apparently they are failing to take any tariff income in certain ports and whatnot. Is all completely chaotic. With the cost of almost all products going down, that's a lie, including gasoline, groceries, and just about everything else, that's a lie. Likewise, inflation is down. Promises made, promises kept. There are some people that said, here, Maine says, this is an insane lie even for him. Some people saying every single word of this post is entirely incorrect. Like, people are just outraged about this particular post just being just a 100% lie. He's just lying to his country, and that is deeply irresponsible. Now, Trump lying about tariffs, what a surprise, says Phillips O'Brien. They are generating hardly any income. Of course, they will make Americans much poorer. So CNBC is reporting that the CBP says the latest tariffs have generated $500 million, well below Trump's estimates. He was saying they're taking $2 billion a day. And is that 500 million overall? So it's just like absolutely way below where it should be. So, US Customs and Border Protection told CNBC the department has collected more than 500 million under Trump's tariffs. So that's what they say they collected in total. And Trump is claiming that they are taking $2 billion a day and that they are taking in record numbers for their tariffs. And it's just lies. Now, China's come back, considering that J.D. Vance, the vice president, has called Chinese peasants and whatnot, and there's a whole big kickback about that. China has set conditions for trade talks with Trump, and it's really interesting because Caroline Leavitt was announcing, and many people have interpreted what she was saying in the White House, saying that Trump is ready for a deal. It's up to China to, she's like, we don't need a deal. It's up to China. If they want a deal, they need to phone us type thing. And it seemed very obvious that was, we're desperate for a deal. Please get in contact with us. We want to do a deal. But not having too much pride, obviously, to admit that they've made a cock up and that they need a trade deal to be done. So China is now setting the conditions for the trade talks. And this is absolutely brilliant from a Chinese point of view. Of course, I'm not particularly on China's side here, but I'm dead against what the US is doing. And, for me, as in Britain sitting in the middle here, I don't want us to be indebted to China, and I don't want us to be indebted to the US in terms of, I don't want them to dictate how we do trade. China. So the US at the moment is doing a trade deal with the UK where they are trying to get us to, just like JD Vance said when he came over to Europe, saying that Europe's got a freedom of speech issue, and the part of our trade deal with the US, they're trying to get us to, I think, take off regulation for social media and stuff like that, and have free speech and blah blah blah, and we're not allowed to support LGBT blah blah blah, all this kind of like woke stuff that they're completely focusing on. But that's part of our trade deal. It's like, what, you're trying to restrain our ability to do what we want, our sovereignty in terms of making rules and laws in our country, just so that, in order to have a trade deal with you. So really a horrible approach from the US. But China is saying, well, we're setting conditions for trade talks with Trump. We want respectful rhetoric. Chinese officials want the Trump cabinet to stop making disparaging remarks. It's like being told off at school. The Americans, I think, have just really overstretched here. They want a clearer, more unified US position on issues like sanctions on Taiwan. So this is also interesting because the Chinese are going, look, what are your positions? You're so incoherent and chaotic that we just want a clearer idea of where you stand on pretty much everything. And China expects a US negotiator. I think this is making the US look like rank amateurs here. Now, as I was just saying, Keir Starmer is told to accept Trump's free speech agenda to win a trade deal. And by free speech, says Timothy Snyder, the Americans mean creating a media environment in your country dominated by American digital fascism, preparatory to right-wing regime change. Vance essentially said as much in Munich. Give in now and forget about sovereignty later. And I'm pretty sure Keir Starmer is going to be really, really reluctant to take on board those things. My position will be, I think this is going to just shove us closer to Europe. We'll end up going, actually, that's too much for us. We're not going to take your chlorinated chicken and techno-fascism, and we are actually going to get closer to Europe. And this will push us in a direction that actually the US won't want. The US is trying to get us away from Europe. That's why Trump was a big fan of Brexit, trying to break apart Europe. Very similar to Putin. Trump and Putin had the same ideals, which is we see Europe as a competitor and kind of as an enemy, and we want to undo the strength of the alliance and the unity of the EU. So both Trump and Putin supported Brexit. Okay, now we're out of the EU. Trump would want us to then come further into the US fold, but then by forcing all these things on us, actually that's going to send Starmer and the Labour government much more likely into the arms of the EU than into the arms of the US. Meanwhile, it's all going wrong domestically within the US. An Ohio paper mill is shutting down, 800 jobs lost. Pixel Paper announced a closing to, quote, better align our resources at a time retaliatory tariffs could increase operating costs at 10 to 15%. Closing the paper mill will cost the local economy $230 to $245 million annually. If some workers relocate or find jobs within 12 to 18 months, the impact could drop to 150 to 180 million, but recovery would still take years. The Chillicothe paper mill was established in 1817 and was operational for 208 years before it announced its enclosure in April. And I presume that is indeed because of the potential operating cost increase and that becoming not economically viable. Beware that there'll be a lot of changes that will happen and excuses will be given that it is a trade war, but actually things were unviable before then. But nonetheless, you're going to see more and more news similar to that. Now, the US could lose up to $90 billion in 2025 as foreign tourism. A lot of people were complaining about this. It's really easy. Phillips O'Brien was saying that he was just looking at June, July flights to the US where they're normally like crazy money. Now they're going for really relatively cheap because they're obviously not booked up. No one wants to go to the US at the moment. Well, far fewer people. People are afraid of being, stopped at the border and there being issues. US could lose $90 billion in 2025 as foreign tourism drops and boycotts of American goods rise, according to Bloomberg. March saw a 10% decline in citizen air arrivals, and Goldman Sachs warns that this could shave 0.3% off GDP if the trend worsens. So it's looking very bad, dropping off the cliff in some cases. Canada particularly, Mexico and Europe, those three areas really being hit hard there. South America as well. That I think will have a really big economic effect. And is going to affect places like Florida, more so. Florida, California. Although that's a red state, then you've got a blue state. But interesting that then talking about California and Gavin Newsom, the governor there, Democratic governor. He's thinking, okay, well, how can we react to this? And he's come up with a very clever advert. So here is Gavin Newsom's California advert.
The Golden State and Canada have always shared so much in common. Sure, you know who's trying to stir things up back in D.C., but don't let that ruin your beach plans. California, it's the ultimate ground, 2,000 miles from Washington and a world away in mindset. From our iconic beaches and national parks to world-class wine, food, and outdoor adventure, there's something here for everyone. Last year, nearly 2 million Canadians visited California, because here in California, we've got plenty of sunshine and a whole lot of love for our neighbors up north.
Really clever there. So he's saying to Canadians, hey, you can come to Canada because we love you here. And yeah, he is making a very clear statement against Trump and, in support of tourists. Man, they need tourists. So as Brian Krusenstein says, this is both an epic troll as well as a genius ad to make sure Canadians don't completely boycott the United States. Sure, you know who is trying to stir things up back in DC, but don't let that ruin your vacation plans. Very clever there. Now, Giorgia Meloni, on behalf of the EU, will meet with Trump in Washington today to revive stalled US-EU trade talks. There's thoughts that actually there's no trade deal that's been done in a 90-day pause on tariffs, although it's not really a pause because there's still 10% across the board, then 25%, 25%, and then 1,000,000% on China. So talks seem to have been stalled. No deals done yet, and we're like 82 days left. And actually, there's something like 90 countries and entities. So you'd expect one a day to be being done. So they're going to have to get a shift on if they want to actually make any trade progress. But yeah, so she's thought to be a bit of a Trump whisperer because the Italian government is a right-wing populist government, otherwise aligned with a lot of what MAGA republicanism stands for. So she's over there trying to revive these trade talks after initial negotiations failed to clarify US demands on tariffs. Meloni's personal rapport with Trump is seen as a key asset, with EU officials hoping she can break the deadlock. And then we have, the EU does have a lot of cards up their sleeves as well. They've advertised some of them, so the US know that if it fails, there could be some trouble for the US. So you put the EU and China together against the US, and then those two entities working much more closely and doing their own trade deals. The problem is for the US, like I said, is that everyone else can go and do deals amongst themselves to offset them, to mitigate the impact of the trade war. But the US can't, because the US is the one doing this to everyone else. So it's then having to rely on that power position to extort trade deals out of others. But if other people feel that is too damaging, they'll just go and try and mitigate 100%. So, okay, you can tariff us to the max. We're going to try and sell all our stuff to China and the EU instead, or whatever the situation is. And there's just economic suicide that is being exacerbated by ridiculous ideologies, such as, just listen to this. This is Sean Duffy, the Transportation Secretary.
Not only that, they put charging stations into this project, Stuart. We pulled those charging stations out, and what we've done across the grants that we give, I'm not doing green. I'm not doing social justice. We're building infrastructure. The last administration wanted all these.
So it said, I'm in charge of stuff, but I'm not doing green. Okay, well, if you think the environment is just pathetic and you want to screw over the environment, or you're just a horrible human, you're just a really stupid human. These people that confuse environmentalism with kind of lefty liberal wokeism, you actually need to future plan. Go and look at the insurance companies and go and look at the banks and when they start saying, right, we need to start be thinking about this and thinking about that, because actually that's going to affect how we trade and how we operate as society, and we're going to think about the impact of climate change. Go and look at the people that deal with money, and then wonder whether environmentalism is woke or whether actually it's future planning our ability to continue operating economically. And then understand that electric cars is something you should be embracing and not eschewing. Now, obviously, fossil fuels are super important for the US. They want to be, pumping oil as much as possible. But if you are going to be showing outright disdain for future-proofing your economic output, then you're not very clever. And so ripping out plans to put in electric vehicle charge points in whatever projects you're doing in building X, Y, and Z is pretty stupid, because actually you're then cutting off a certain amount of your demographic as being able to access that project, and it's just utterly ridiculous. But it's this idea that, you know, electric vehicles are woke, while at the same time you've got all these big trucks now surrounding, these big petrol guzzling trucks surrounding Tesla dealerships, because these MAGA people are so worried that Elon Musk is going to kind of lose money and whatnot. I've got this planned for a bit later. Where is it? Do I have it here? Oh no, I haven't got it. So there's a really, really interesting video on this. I think I do have it actually. It's in my US section here it is. So you've got these MAGA drivers driving up to protect Tesla dealerships from protesters, and they're surrounding these dealerships with these huge SUVs, 4x4s and Trump flags, which then is itself scaring away people from actually going to genuinely want to buy. The sort of people that are going to buy Teslas really aren't your Trump MAGA flag waving peeps like that, right? So already you're suffering because Elon Musk has become effectively a fascist, and then you're suffering even more because you're surrounding these places with big old trucks. But anyway, I digress. It's the idea that that you are cutting off these projects from the whole of society from accessing them. It's economically stupid. It's socially stupid. It's just stupid. And I think, you know, this kind of ideology that, you know, social justice is wrong. We shouldn't have social justice. Or we shouldn't have social fairness. Okay, so you like social injustice, right? So you're a big fan of social injustice. Okay, and you're not a fan of the environment. You want to destroy the environment. So you would rather live in a place that's just desolate and surrounded by people who are just trying to oppress other people and, I don't know, be horrible to them. Right? Is that the world you want to live in? Good. Well, you can feck off to Mars then. Yeah. So even David D, who's like, before the Trump administration, was a complete Trump fan, and he's a massive Republican, more on the kind of Ukraine war side of things. He said Doge has saved $155 billion according to them, right? And we'll talk about that in a second. While the US has lost nearly $400 billion in arms sales to our former friends. So now that people are completely wary of the Americans, we're now starting to buy stuff from elsewhere rather than from the US. He says $50 billion in sales to Ukraine. So now the US has stopped in refusing to sell loads of stuff to the Ukrainians, such as Patriot systems and missiles. And he's talking about $50 billion in sales to Ukraine, $6 trillion in lost stock value, over $1 trillion in lost trade to the world, $40 billion in farm bailouts, etc., etc. Things are not going as planned. That's coming from an otherwise, you know, Republican Trump voter, right? So there is a realization that things are not going well. And when you look at what Doge claims, the reality is completely different. So Musk's cost-cutting claims were that during the campaign, Doge was going to save $2 trillion. $2 trillion is what he claimed. And then as the beginning of the inauguration happened, and 10 days later, it's like, actually, maybe $1 trillion. And even that, he was saying at a push or whatever. So then taking it down by half. Then on April the 10th, it's like, yeah, 150 billion. And then the claimed savings of that are like 92 billion without any details. So we saved 92 billion. How have you done that? Well, I'm not going to tell you. And then the ones they have itemized, 63 billion of that. So this is that kind of 155 billion that you see there. That's what their estimated savings are. But like 92 billion of that is like, yeah, we're not telling you what it is. 63 billion is itemized receipts, but loads of major errors. They're just full of erroneous claims. And so this is insane and illegal. And also, I think, you know, when you're talking about cutting IRS jobs, and they give you back, you know, for every dollar you spend in the IRS, they get back on average 7, but actually you're cutting it on the area of the work that operates on bigger corporations, so they get even more money back for the work that they do. You're cutting that, so that's going to affect your income from the IRS. You are then laying off loads of government workers, so that's going to going to demotivate or destimulate the economy, depress the economy. You are then having a trade war with the rest of the world, so exports are going to go down, imports are going to go down, or at least become way more expensive, so that's going to have an inflationary impact. And then this all impacts, by the way, Trump's his popularity. So at the moment, Trump's approval rating is falling. He is breaking his own record for quickly angering American voters. According to The Economist, his approval rating has fallen by 14 points since taking office, exceeding the 5-point drop during the same period of his first term. I mean, it's gone. He is tanking at the moment. Trump 2.0 is his handling of the economy is seen as absolutely terrible, and his overall presidential approval ratings are now below where he was in Trump 1.0. This is not looking good, and it's going the wrong way everywhere in red states and blue alike. And this is people like Harry Enton are having a field day over this, saying that this is an absolute shocker for Trump.
Yeah, we'll focus in on independents here, and independents feel that Donald Trump has vacated the center of the electorate, catering to his base. What are we talking about? Well, let's talk about the overall net approval ratings. We're going to look at the worst ever at this point in a presidency. The old record among independents for the worst ever was Donald Trump back in 2016, a net approval rating of minus 16 points. Well, Donald Trump has broken his own record here. He now holds, in this particular term, the worst ever net approval rating at this point in a presidency among independents at, get this, minus 22 points. He is 22 points underwater with independents. That breaks the old record that belonged to Trump. He has set the new record. He is completely underwater with the center of the electorate, Kate Baldwin.
And this is overall. This
Yes.
is on all the issues. Now, focus in specifically on the economy.
Yeah, let's focus in on the economy, right? What is driving this overall approval rating for Donald Trump among independents to go underwater? Let's take a look at the economy, and let's take a look at Trump's net approval rating on it and look at the trend line over just the last few months. You go back to January, he was slightly above water with independents at plus 1 point. Look at this drop, Kate. Oh my, minus 29 points. That's a 30-point drop in under 3 months of time. What independents are hearing from Donald Trump, they hate. They hate what they're hearing from Donald Trump, and they are abandoning him in record numbers. At this point in his last presidency, he was about at 0 points in terms of his net approval rating on the economy, and now he's at minus 29 points. You go back through the record books, I simply put, Kate Baldwin, can't find anything close to this. This is such a record that there is no historical analogy to be 29 points underwater on the most important issue of the day with independents. This right here, my dear friends, is political poison. If an election were held today and Donald Trump's net approval rating in the economy was minus 29 points with independents, I'm not quite sure how Republicans can hold on to the House of Representatives.
And he does need to be careful because he's very close to wetting himself.
Is it all tariffs that are driving this?
Yeah, okay. So let's take a look here at tariffs. This is definitely part of it. A clear plan for tariffs and trade among independents. Look at this. 57% say no. He doesn't even have a clear plan for what he should be doing with tariffs and trade. And when asked whether or not they like the idea of additional tariffs, guess what percentage of independents say no, that they oppose it? It is 2/3. It is 66% of independents who oppose new tariffs. They don't like anything that's coming out of Donald Trump's right now, absent maybe immigration. But when it comes to the economy, when it comes to overall, when it comes to tariff, it's a threesome for negativity among independents. They oppose, oppose, oppose. They simply do not like the words that are coming out of Donald Trump's mouth and the plans that he is putting forward to the American public.
So showing that it's not just economic risk that he's taking with the just wait, it will get better on his tariff plan. It's a political risk as well, which is just wait, it'll get better. So.
You know what? They can wait, what is it, about 18 months until the midterm elections? Yeah. But eventually the bill will come due, and we'll see at that time whether or not independents turn around on Donald Trump. It would have to take something historic for it to occur.
It's not good news for the support of Donald Trump in that among the independents, but that's going to be even more so among Democrats, and then to some degree among Republicans themselves. And so that will translate, if it continues like this, into some pretty dire midterm election results. But that's a long way away. But at the moment, things are not looking good. And as I say, the cards are held by the Chinese here. And I don't think that the United States is going to win this. And it's going to be interesting to see how other nations play it. Do they capitulate? Smaller nations capitulate to trade deals from the US, where the US get to screw over, say, Vietnam? Or do they get together and say, no, we're going to resist this together in some way? Or, just say, we'll weather the storm with the US. We won't do a trade deal that screws us over. And we'll try and mitigate this by doing free trade deals with other nations around the world and the EU and China. And of course, that then brings a sense of unity with the rest of the world against the United States. They really have done shot themselves in the foot multiple times, politically and economically, the United States and the Trump administration. Anyway, let me know what you think. That's my tariffs synopsis for the time being. Take care and speak soon.